listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it's the story that has gripped the world. A mother accused of poisoning her relatives in a deadly mushroom lunch in regional Victoria. Erin Patterson's trial started this week with explosive allegations. We chat with 7 News reporter Estelle Greipink about the twists and turns, including inheritances, mushroom dehydrators and text messages. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Friday, the 2nd of May. On election eve, both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton are pushing through with last-minute campaigning in marginal seats. Latest stats show nearly 40% of Australians have already voted. A new Freshwater poll has Labor still on track to win a minority government.
I don't take the Australian people for granted. I'm working my guts out to ensure there's a majority government tomorrow.
Meantime, Peter Dutton argues this election is a referendum on the cost of living and says he is still optimistic he can pull off a surprise Liberal upset tomorrow.
I want to make sure that we can get our country back on track, that we can manage our economy well, and only a Liberal government can do that.
In other news, a helicopter has crashed in waters southwest of Melbourne. It's believed the 3 people on board managed to swim to safety but are now in hospital in a serious condition. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau is investigating. And while all the official polls are still pointing to a Labor win tomorrow, could they be wrong again, like in 2019? A psychic crocodile has made a shock prediction about who could win tomorrow's federal election. The 4.8-metre salty, known as Speckles, predicted Peter Dutton would win by choosing a chunk of meat with the Liberal leader's face hanging above it. Speckles has form in getting it right after correctly calling that Anthony Albanese would win the last federal election in 2022. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with 7 News reporter Estelle Greipink on the murder trial of Erin Patterson. The mother is charged with the murders of 3 relatives after a deadly mushroom lunch. Estelle, thanks so much for joining us. This is such a fascinating case that has not only captured Australia's attention, but international attention. Take us through what we know so far about Erin Patterson and this trial.
Yeah, this is such an interesting case, Tash. So what we know is that Erin Patterson is charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. And this relates to a lunch that she had at her home in Leongatha back in 2023. So the 4 guests were Don and Gail Patterson, her in-laws, and also Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and her husband, Ian Wilkinson, who was the local pastor at Currumbara, a town about 2 hours away from Melbourne. So the 4 of them were invited to Erin Patterson's house to have a lunch, and it's there that she served them beef Wellingtons that had pastry and mushrooms. About 12 hours after they consumed those beef Wellingtons, all of them felt extremely ill with gastro symptoms, and 3 of them ended up passing away. So this is now the subject of this murder trial, and she has obviously pleaded not guilty. She says she's innocent and that this was all just a tragic accident.
Estelle, can you take us through exactly what the jury has heard this week during the trial?
Yeah, I think, on the day of the openings, I think it was on Wednesday, we heard a lot of information. One of the first things we heard was about that lunch, and they actually said that Erin is alleged to have put 4 individually served beef Wellingtons on large grey plates for the guests. But the guests noticed that she put her own on a smaller coloured plate. And one of the guests later remarked, does she not have enough plates? Is she short on crockery? Another thing, police had tracked her phone to 2 towns, Outram and Lock in Victoria. And a couple of days prior to that, on this website called iNaturalist, where people can post about plants they've found and they sort of put the location, 2 people had posted about finding death cap mushrooms in those locations. So that's something the prosecution is using as part of their argument as to why Erin Patterson is guilty. Another thing that they talked about quite extensively was a food dehydrator. Now, this is something that when Erin Patterson initially spoke to police, she said she didn't have a food dehydrator, but police went to the tip after this lunch and they say they found one with Erin Patterson's fingerprints on it. And they also alleged they tested it and they found samples of death cap mushrooms on it. So that's another part of their case. They revealed the reason that they say Erin Patterson invited her in-laws over to her house for lunch in the first place. And she apparently told them she'd been diagnosed with cancer. And it's now come out that the prosecution and the defense both agree that was actually a lie and that she doesn't have cancer. We saw text messages yesterday between Simon Patterson, her ex-husband. They were separated but sort of on good terms, and Erin Patterson. So she'd invited him to this fatal lunch as well, but he didn't end up attending. And when he pulled out the night before and he texted and said, I don't feel comfortable coming, she wrote back and said that she was really disappointed. And she also said she'd spent a fortune on beef fillet to make these beef Wellingtons because she wanted it to be a really special meal and she really hoped that he could be there. So certainly it's been a jam-packed week of evidence.
Estelle, there's also been allegations that had come out regarding an inheritance.
Yes.
For Erin, that she had inherited $2 million from her grandmother and that had been shared with her ex-husband's relatives.
Yes. I think we had always known that Erin Patterson had some degree of money. In fact, the house where the lunch was held, if you've seen shots of it before on the news, is quite a nice looking 2-story. I think it's a 5-bedroom house. But in court, it did come out this week that she had inherited about $2 million from her grandmother and that money had been used by the Pattersons to give interest-free loans of hundreds of thousands of dollars to some of Mr. Patterson's siblings. And this came out when the defence were talking to Mr. Patterson about Erin's character, and they had put it to him that she was quite generous and then referenced these loans. And Simon Patterson, well, he agreed. He said, yeah, she was pretty generous.
The court has heard about these text messages between Erin and her ex-husband. And today it's been revealed that her ex-husband is alleging in court that Erin, over recent years, and talking about when these circumstances happened, that she had become quite aggressive. Did you hear any more about what that may have meant in court?
Yes, and I think it's interesting how the evidence has sort of progressed from yesterday till today, because they started yesterday talking about the relationship in the early years and perhaps the early years of the separation when they were quite friendly and they got along and they would even text a bit of banter, talk about politics. But in those later years, and now I'm referring to maybe 2022, the incident happened in 2023, Simon said that things started to change. You know, they'd have arguments, or he described the relationship as becoming a bit more tense. And he used the words extremely aggressive to describe some of the texts that Erin sent him. And this was in the context of talking about things like child support, payments and that sort of thing. And that's something that had really soured their relationship. Simon Patterson had previously given evidence that for a long time their relationship was pretty good. But then one year, Erin Patterson saw that on his tax return, he'd been listed as separated. And she took issue with that because she realised it meant that he should probably be paying her child support. And that sort of started the tensions between them.
Still, we also heard that Erin, although her in-laws had been taken to hospital incredibly unwell, that she allegedly didn't ask her ex-husband on the health or the situation of her relatives within hospital.
Yes, and this came out today when the defence were speaking to Simon Patterson. It was actually, they asked Simon Patterson, did you tell Erin Patterson how serious the situation was? Was she even aware that they were so seriously ill? And that's when he said, well, she didn't ask. Yeah, they definitely have been focusing a lot on those days after the lunch and what happened when people were in and out of hospital.
And there were also allegations that Erin was very scared or didn't like hospitals. What's that about?
Yeah, Simon Patterson said in his evidence she hated hospitals, and that's because her defence lawyer said, is it true that Erin might have a history of not liking hospitals, maybe being in hospital and leaving before a doctor has really given her the all clear, because that's what's alleged to have happened in this situation, that she went to hospital and she was quite reluctant to be there, to the extent that she was also reluctant to bring her kids in, even though doctors had said, look, if your kids have had any of this beef Wellington, even if it was as leftovers, even if it was that you scraped the mushrooms off, you should be bringing them in just to seek medical treatment. And she was reluctant to do that. So there was discussion today about how Erin doesn't like hospitals and the kids haven't had the best experience with them either. And that's why she didn't want to make them feel stressed or scared by bringing them in.
The courts also heard, Estelle, as we mentioned earlier, these allegations from Erin's ex-husband that she had become incredibly aggressive. Was there also evidence provided about her mental health, about battles with postnatal depression after she'd given birth to one of her children?
Yes, Simon did mention that he believes she had postnatal depression, and this was during a discussion where they were talking about other health issues that Erin potentially had. They were talking about how Erin may have, believed that she was sick or had certain illnesses in the past, and Simon was going through some of them and saying, look, I have no reason to believe that that's not true. And one of the illnesses I would say that he brought up was postnatal depression.
Estelle, we've seen a jam-packed 4 days of evidence so far in this murder trial. And as you've spoken about before, Erin Patterson has denied any wrongdoing and has pled not guilty to all of these charges. Who else are we expecting to give evidence? Any idea of who is set to appear in court next week?
Look, at this point, we're not sure. And that's because in this case, we haven't really been provided a list of witnesses. All I can tell you at this point is that Simon Patterson is going to be back in the stand on Monday. So that's a third day of evidence from him. But I guess he is quite a crucial witness in all of this. So we'll have to see what he has to say.
That was 7 News reporter Estelle Greipink. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back with the weekend briefing tomorrow. And on tomorrow's episode, Antoinette is joined by former Australian foreign correspondent Peter Grester, who spent more than 2 years in an Egyptian prison.
The first couple of weeks was in solitary confinement, which it turns out is a fairly routine way of processing prisoners, new arrivals. You get stuck in these boxes and they basically leave you to it, leave you to your own devices for at least a couple of weeks. They say it's a medical quarantine, but anybody who's been through that experience would recognise very quickly that it's got nothing to do with medical treatment and everything to do with the psychological pressure.
And you can follow us on our socials, on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, or on TikTok and YouTube. You just need to search Listener Newsroom. That's spelled LISTNR. I'm Natarsha Belling. Have a lovely weekend. See you next week.